Hello there everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, we'll be moving off from where we left off in part 1 of this series, where we created this working API. In this API, we could create, read, update, and delete all the CRUD applications to our expense data. Now in this video, we'll be moving on from where we left off over there. The first thing we'll be doing is adding services in our server project. Now, we don't want what are called fat controllers, which is what we have right now. Let me open Visual Studio so you have a look. So in the last video, we created this controller for our expenses for our API. And we'll see that everything is done in this controller, but we want to separate some of the stuff out of it so that we have our code being more modular. We want to actually just separate out the actual calls using the context, the actual calls to our database, and then just have the controller dealing with the HTTP requests. So to do that, we'll go on and click on our Blazor expense tracker server application. And what we are doing is we want to go to add a new folder. We're going to call the folder services. Then we'll go ahead and right click on that services folder and add another folder. And we're going to name the folder expense service. Expense service. If I could only spell well. expense service, yeah, like that. Then we'll go ahead, right click on it again and add an interface. And to do that, we'll go to add and then click on class. Okay, but when we get to class, we'll select interface from up here. And then we're going to name this expense service, but since it's an interface, it's going to be expense service. We're going to click add, and it gives us this interface. We also need to now add our class itself. So we'll go to add and then also click class. We're going to name it expense service. Now, finally, we want to make expense service inherit from expense service. Go ahead and save that. The next thing we want to do is actually to register our hot reload. Okay, we don't want it to hot reload. We want to stop that. We want to close our running application to stop that message from showing. So I go ahead, close that. Also close the console. Now let's get back to what we're doing. So we want to actually register the service we just created, that's expense service. So to do that, we would go to program.cs right here in our server application, program.cs. Can double click on that. And in here, we're going to where we added a Swagger gen, and we'll go ahead and add builder.services add scoped. And then in here, we'll add expense service, comma, expense service, and add some brackets or some braces, and finally our semicolon. We can go ahead and save. So that's basically how we register our service. And you'll notice that upon saving, we have gotten the using statement over here from server.services.expense service. So now that it's registered, it means that we can use our services in our application. So let's get back to our interface and then add some code into our interface. So in our interface, we're going to add the following. We're going to add a task list of expense model, and we're going to name it get expenses async. Okay, so that's what's going to be implemented into our class, and then when we call on the interface, we can actually get access to the class itself. Okay, so this is the first one. That's for get expenses async. Then we want to add another one for create expenses async. And this time we want to add the expense model, but we won't call it model, we'll call it expense. Okay, great. Then the next one, have task expense model, and then we want to call that one edit expense async. In this case, you need the expense and also the ID. Add a semicolon. Then we'll have the final one for remove expense. That will not return anything, so just task remove expense, and we need to get the ID. Okay, let me check if everything is correct. Yes, it is. So we can save that and then go to our expense service. Over here, we see that there's an error showing. We can click Control dot, gives us some options, and over here it says implement interface. So we'll just double click on that, and then it implements all the interface that we've just created. Okay, so from there we can go ahead and add the bodies for each of these functions or methods. Okay, so for create expense async, the first thing we're going to do is add an async modifier here, so that the whole function becomes an async function. So we go with var response equals, so we're going to await. Okay, so first, before this, we need to actually add a controller and then bring in our context or data context. Sorry for that. So we can just type ctr, hit tab twice, and we have our controller. Then in here, we're going to bring in data context, just like we did in our controller. And then we're going to call that data context. Then we can also control dot, then we'll just click on create an assigned field context. Then it will give us a field, but then we don't want to use it this way. We want to use underscore. You can remove the this and put underscore. Okay, so from there we can come back to our create expense async method, and after the await, we can now use context. So underscore context dot expenses. So in our context, we have expenses, which is our table for expenses. Then we'll click on dot, then add async. And then we add the expenses that has been passed into the method. Go below, then we await underscore context. We will save changes. Then we just return response. Notice that response, the return type is entity entry expense model. So we need to return expense dot entity. That will return the entity itself. Okay, so that was great. That's for create expense. Next one is edit expense. We delete the default code in there, and then we create a variable response. It will be expense model response. We'll equate it to null. Then can have var db expense equal await underscore context like we did up there dot expenses dot first or default async. We can have e dot id equals id. Okay, just like we did in the controller. Put our semicolon. Then we want to check now for our DB. We want to check if it's null. Then if it's null, we can go ahead and we just copy this to make things a bit faster. So we can go ahead and just edit each of these pieces of data in our expense. So we'll take that db expense dot amount that we created to expense dot amount, which is the expense that is coming out from maybe our front end. So that expense, we pick the amount and then we create them just as we did in the controller. So basically what we are doing is picking some of the code from our controller and putting it here, and we'll later remove that code from the controller just to separate things a little bit more. So finally we have to await underscore context and we'll dot save changes async. We forget our semicolon. Then we want to assign db expense to response. Then finally we want to return response semicolon. Now let's quickly move on. You can save that and quickly move on to get expenses async. So over there to create a variable response. And we'll await underscore context dot expenses dot to list async. Not forgetting our not forgetting our semicolon, and then we just return response, and that's it. Finally we go to remove expense variable db expense, because we want to see if the actual expense we want to delete is in the database. Context dot expenses dot first or default async, just as we did in the edit. Okay, so e dot id equals id, and then we need to add our semicolon. We'll check if db expense is not equal to null. I think we might have made a mistake somewhere up here. Okay, here too it's supposed to be not equal. Sorry about that. not equal. It's not equal to null. Not equal to null. Sorry for that. Just using the autocomplete there. Sorry about that. So over here too, we're going to use db expense not equal to null. And then we'll come in here. So what we do is call the context dot expenses dot remove db expense. And finally, we'll wait underscore context dot save changes async. Okay, so now we're done with our services. Those are all the services we need for the meantime. We can go back to our controller, expenses controller, and over here we're going to edit the code, and so that we remove the stuff we moved out of here from here. So the first thing is we need to remove this from our controller. We need to remove context and instead inject expense service. So let's just remove context. Okay, and then in here we're going to call I expense service. We're going to call it expense service. Expense. Okay, expense service. We'll add a field, control dot. It's a assign field. Going to change that to underscore. So now we have expense service available here, but we see the errors for underscore context. So in get all expenses, let's just clean this out. In get all expenses, what we'll do is have list of expense model. That's the return type we're expecting. We call that response. We equate it to await underscore expense service, and then we dot access method that gets, then we finally just return okay response. That's it. So accessing the context and accessing the database is no more happening here. All we do is our HTTP request. Okay, so in the post too, we can go ahead and delete the code over there. Now create expense async. We could do something similar here. We can just have expense model. I'm going to call this response equals await underscore expense service dot. This is the method we created for creating an expense. Yes, and then we finally just return okay response. As simple as that. Now when we come to the edit or the put, edit expenses, you can go ahead and delete the code in here too. Going to create our response expense model. Response equal await underscore expense service dot edit expense async, and we can add the expense and then the ID, and finally we just return okay with response. Okay, everything is done in the service. And finally for the delete or remove expense, we just await underscore expense service dot remove expense, and we add the ID as a parameter. Control save, and that is that. So finally, let's just go ahead and test this out. So we can just click start without debugging, and let's just wait for it to start up. Okay, we can go ahead and add Swagger at the end of our URL. That will take us to the API documentation. So we can just test this out. So we'll test get expenses, click try it out, and just click execute. Okay, it worked perfectly. So that means that is working. You can just try out maybe post. So let's add buy piano again. A piano. 1,000. Just click execute. Okay, so we have success. We can then go ahead. Let's just look at the ID that was created. Okay, it says 6. Yours may be different. Mine is 6. So when we go to edit, we'll need to enter the ID over here. So we click try it out. Then enter the ID 6 over here. Then let's change it to buy a guitar. And the amount could be 300. Execute. Good. We have a positive response, and it's changed to buy a guitar. Can go ahead, use the get to check if it's here. Execute, and it's here. Buy a guitar. Finally, let's test the delete. Remember, our ID was 6. Enter 6. Execute, and that's done. We have a positive response of 200. Go back and check if it's still here or it's gone. Execute, and realize it's gone. We're left with our 3 initial seed data. So that's great. Everything is working perfectly, meaning our service is working, and our controller is also working perfectly. So let's just close this up and move on to our front end. We'll come to our front end and add code to our index.razor page, which is basically our home page. So we can double click on index.razor right here. Okay, and let's just remove all this default code over here and go ahead and add some mock data that will just show us how our application will look on the home page. Okay, then we'll later get the data from the database and show that in our front end. Okay, so first thing we'll be adding here is the add page. Okay, so this is just the route that will open this page. So when it's just the home page or just slash, it will open this page. Then we can add the page title. Page title is going to be home. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is add the code section. So that will be at code. Yeah, so later we'll be adding our code in here. Now between the add page and add code, we can put our HTTP stuff, okay, and our Blazor stuff. Okay, so in here we'll just add a div. Now I'm going to be using inline styling a lot. And later I'll maybe create a class for the styles, but as we build, I'll be using inline styling. So div, and we're going to style it this way. Style we add display, we make that flex. Then we're going to go with the flex direction, column. Then we justify content center. Okay, so I'm just realizing something, that if I decide to type out all these styles, it may take a long time, and the styles are the styles. So I'm just going to copy from my notes and just paste them to make things a bit shorter, so that we can move on a little bit faster. So we'll add another div, and in this case, when I add the style, I'll just copy it and paste the style over here. So we have display flex and justify content end, and we'll have an href over here. Okay, let's just add the href. It can just be hash. Then in here we're going to put an svg, which is basically an image. Okay, so all this code will be available in my GitHub, so you can just sort of copy the styles and then also all these SVGs. Okay, so I have this SVG down here. I'll just copy it and paste it in the code. And then yes, so that's basically the first button that's going to be at the top of the application. Okay, so let's just save that and just run it and have a look at how our application is looking. Okay, so there we have it right here. That's what we just created, the SVG we just added. I think I could minimize this a bit and sort of have us look at it whilst we add the code. We're done with this div, and we would like to add another div where we are going to have our total expenses and other stuff show up. So we add another div, and then here too we add our styling. Then we'll have a paragraph tag, and then here we're going to put total expenses. We'll add a style, just color gray. We'll save that and we can see it here, total expenses. Okay, then we'll add an h2, and we'll just put in maybe $100.00. Then also a little bit of styling here. You just copy it from here and paste it. Okay, and then the next div. So let's save that and have a look. Okay, so it appears right below here. Then in the next div, we're actually going to deal with our list items. That'll be the list of expenses. So I just add the style here, copy and paste, and then we'll add another div in here. Also copy and paste the styling, and another div. Then we'll also copy and paste the styling again. You could slow down the video. I don't think that will help much. So maybe you'd have to check out the GitHub page to get all the styling that I'm using. Or even the blog post. The blog post too, you see all the code over there. So you can do any of that and I'm sure you'll be okay. So in this div now we can add some p tags. So let me just copy them and paste them here. Okay. Let's save that and have a look. Okay, so we have this right here. Now the next thing we're going to add is we want to add an icon for editing and also an icon for deleting. Okay, so that will also be in a div. before the icons, we want to add the amount first. So let's add the div for the amount right below here. Okay, so that will show up at the end. But after that, we want to add another div with an SVG, which is an angle for an icon, sorry, for a pencil and edit, sort of an edit button. Okay, can save that and have a look. That's nice. Then we also want to add another div with an SVG for our delete button. Okay, great. This is basically how our application is going to look. I think I might just need to add a padding on top of one of the sections, the section where we have our list. Okay, okay, that's nice. So we can even increase it to 32. I think that will look better. Yep, so yeah, I think that's okay. So now this is how we want our homepage to look with our total expenses, and then each expense will be laid out. Okay, so that's that. We can now move ahead, and since we want to show our data instead of just this mock data that we've shown here in the front end, we'll also go ahead and add services to our client. So let me close this and open my Visual Studio a little bit bigger. Let me also close the console. Okay, and now we're going to, in our client project, we want to add services. So we'll do something similar to what we did with what we did in the server project. So we're just going to right click on the client and then add a folder. We're going to call the folder services. Then in the services folder, we're going to have expense and another folder called expense service. Then in there, no, let me edit this name. Expense service. Sorry for the mistake. Yes. Then inside the expense service, now we add our interface. So we can have interface. And we're going to call it expense service. Expense service. Sorry. Click add. So we have our interface. Then we add a class expense service. Now we let expense service inherit from expense service. And then we go ahead and add the code for expense service. Okay. So in expense service, we'll first need a list of expense model called expenses. Sorry about that. Called expenses. I'm going to make that okay. Yeah. Okay. Let me just add it using a shortcut. So we're going to add two properties actually. But let's just forget about the modifier, and it's going to be a list of expense model. Okay, and we're going to name it expenses. Okay, and obviously get and setter. Let's just control D this, but in this case we want to also show decimal. I'm going to call that total expenses. Okay, so the reason why we have these two properties is just for easier access in our in our index.razor so that we can just sort of get a list of expenses from our database, then store that value in this property, and then easily access it in index.razor. The same thing goes for our total expenses. So that's why we have that there. Now I'll just add a normal tax list of expense model, just like we have at the backend. So I'm just going to copy it and paste so I can save some time. Okay, so we have tax list of expense model, get expenses async, then we have create expenses, just almost identical to what we created at the backend. So you can have a look at that, and I'll save it and move on to the expense service file. And then we go ahead and implement. So control dot, it says implement interface. So we go ahead and implement the interface. It gives us all our properties, everything. I want to simplify this. I want to remove this throw from here. Just have a simple, nice property. Okay, so I want to do that up and over here too. Okay. Yeah. Then the next thing, let's remove this guy. Next thing we're going to do is add our constructor. And then in our constructor, we're going to bring in HTTP client. Okay, we're going to call it HTTP. Same thing we always do, assign field, and we change it to underscore instead of this. Then we can go ahead and add our code in each of our methods. So in create expense async, we'll create a variable response. Okay, and equals await. So all we need to do, make sure this is an async statement or we'll have an error. Okay, great. So we're going to await underscore HTTP. We're going to make a JSON request on HTTP using JSON. So paste as JSON. Sorry, we are creating, so post as JSON async. We just want to add the type here, so the model expense model. Okay, and then it sorry about that. It's expense model the type. Then we want to finally add the API endpoint. So that's going to be /API /expenses and then comma expense. Okay, so this is the API endpoint, and then this is the value that we want to send to the API endpoint. We are using this method, and that's part of the HTTP client library. So we just post as JSON. Okay, so next thing we just return await. We want the response. Okay, so it's an HTTP response message. So response dot the content of the response dot we want to read from scroll and just type read from JSON async. Okay, the type was expense model. Then yeah, we close it up. Okay, so our errors are gone. Just a little warning here, but our errors are gone. So this should work fine. And in the edit expenses to do something similar. So I can just go ahead and just copy this right here and paste it over here. Okay, but instead of posts as JSON async, I think we use put as JSON async. But in this case, we need to change the request URL. It's supposed to be API slash expenses slash ID. Okay, then we have the expense over here. Okay, so I'm having my error because I need to put async over here. Control save. So that's the first thing. So as we move on to get expenses, first we need to put async here. And then in here we create our variable the same. So we could just copy and paste. Okay, and in this case we'll be using, instead of put as JSON async, we'll be using get from JSON async. Okay, since we are getting expenses, get from JSON async, and we'll change the request URL and also remove this because get requests don't have a field for the model. Okay, so let's actually remove this return. We have to check first if the response is not equal to null, then expenses. Okay, so we're just trying to now, as I said earlier, set the value of these two properties. So expenses, okay, so if the response is not null, if the response is null, means that there's no data in our expenses table. But if it's not, then we want to now go and take the value for expenses and then assign response to it. Expenses equal response. Okay, then we'll also at this point need to calculate the total. I don't understand why. Okay, let's just look at this. Return expenses. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. So that's what makes copy and paste a bit dangerous. Okay, so we have to have this type being list of expenses. Okay, list of expense model. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, and the error goes away. Okay, so over here we want to be able to calculate total expenses. So whenever we get our expenses, we want to be able to calculate the total expenses and then show it in our front end. You understand? So we need to create a method for this, but this method doesn't need to be accessed in the interface. So it's just going to be a private method over here. We are going to name it calculate total expenses. We can just have private void. It won't be returning anything. Call it calculate total expenses. Okay, no parameters. All we do is set the value of total expenses to 0. The reason why we do that is anytime it loads, we just want to set to 0. And okay, we may not need to do this, so let's just remove that, and let's just use for each statement. We can say for each expense, in the collection. So we're going to name for each expense should be in expenses. Okay, as up there. What we're going to do is take total expenses. Okay, sorry. The reason why we need to set total expenses to 0 is since at every time we are going to be adding to the expenses, if we don't set it to 0 and we keep adding, the number is just going to be wrong every time. So we need to always set it to 0 whenever we want to calculate, and then just go ahead and grab all the amounts from each of the expenses that we call and add them together. Okay, so expenses plus equal to expense dot amounts. Expenses, sorry. Okay, expense dot amount. This is just a short form for, it could also have been written as total expenses. Total expenses equal total expenses plus each expense dot amount. Okay, so it could have been written like this, but this is just a shorthand, so we're just going to use the shorthand. Control save, and we have that. So now we'll go back to our index.razor and be able to pull that data into our front end. Okay, so we're going to go to the code section of index.razor, and even before we do that, we need to register again. We need to register our services. So we go to program.cs, this time in the client project. Then we do something similar. So we have a builder dot services dot add scope and I expense service, comma expense service. Okay, we can go ahead and save that. And then now we go into our index.razor file. Okay, and we go to the add code section. And at the add code section, we are going to call override a function. It's going to be, the function is called protected override it async task on initialized async uninitialized async uninitialized async. Okay, so whenever the component is initialized, it will run this, it will run whatever is in this bracket. So what we are going to run is we'll need expense service. So the first thing, before we can actually run something from our services, we need to inject it into our Blazor page. So we come up here, add an at inject, then what we do is add I expense service. I'm going to call it expense service. There's an error. Let's check. We need to add a using statement. Okay, but let's say we really don't want to add this using statement over here. So let's we'll cut it and then we'll add it to imports over here. Okay, so we'll just come below here and add it here. Okay, so yep, that should work. We can get back to index.razor and realize that it's gone out of here. Just don't want to put any using statements there since that file is available. Okay, so down here, what we are going to do now is await. This is an async method. Okay, so we can await expense service. Sorry about that. Okay, dot get expenses async. Okay, that's the one we want. So every time our application is a component, this Razor page is initialized, we want to be able to get expenses. Now we know that in expense service, when we get expenses, as seen over here. Yep, get expenses. What we do is we set the value of expenses over here to the response, and then we calculate the total expenses. And that also calculate total expenses also sets the value of total expenses. So now we can use both expenses and total expenses in our application. So we'll come up here in our sort of HTML. So we'll come up here and okay, so this is where our first H2 is. Okay, let's just run this so that it looks a bit simple for us. Okay, so let's run it. Just wait for it to build and to load up. Okay. Yep. Let me just put the windows side by side. Okay. So over here, I want to put total expenses over here. So what we're going to do is have to find where it is, and there it is right here. We can go ahead and after the $sign, we want to add at want to add basically just so we're just going to go to at expense service dot, yes, the property called total expenses. Yep. So if we should click save, that should build. So we have it here. So 110 is the total expenses. Now let's move down and also look at where we can add get our list of expenses. So that's the next thing. So if we come down here and see where we've put our code over here to hold each expense, that's where we are going to add a for each. Okay, so at for each. Okay, so that for each is just going to cycle over all the data that will be gotten. If I could just type. Okay, so for each let's say variable expense in at expense service dot total, what am I typing? At expense service dot expenses. Okay, so that's that property. Go to expense service, that property right here, expense service dot expenses. Okay, index eraser. Okay, so expense service for expenses. So for every expense in expense services dot expenses, we can add an at sign here. Then let's add our curly braces, and then in our curly braces we're going to put all this code here. That's the code for each item in the list. Just going to cut that, Control X, and then paste it right in here. So now what we want to do is for the individual data in here, we want to actually put the proper data. So this is the date. Okay, for the date, okay, let me start from the top. Okay, so from the top, the first thing is eat out, which is the title. So it's supposed to be the title. So what we can say is we're saying for each expense, so we can just go ahead and say at expense dot title. So that'll just put a title, proper title up here. Then over here too, we can just go at expense dot created at. Okay, but we need to format that a bit. So to string, and then the formatting we are going to be using is this right here. Let me copy it from below here. Okay, So this is just going to help our date come out in this form: day, day, month, 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 year, year, and then the time. Okay. Then the next one is also the amount for each. So can leave the dollar sign. We'll go with at expense dot amount. Okay, so amount for each. Yep, and I think that is it. So we can go ahead and save and have a look. Okay, so there we have it. Each data showing up over here. Bought a snack, there's the time, the amount, and everything. I think there's a little problem with how this looks. I don't want it to look this way, so I need to change this. It's a problem with the styling actually, so I have to find where I have border bottom. Okay, so I want to change this. Okay. Okay, so I think the problem is my for each is placed a bit wrong. So I have to cut it off and place it rather here. Okay. Yes, and then I'll tab this in. So I was supposed to put the whole. Okay, so I also need to bring this div up here. Okay. So sorry for that. Yes, so that works. Okay, so let's save it and see. Okay, so I know that was a little bit confusing, but if you check out the blog, I'm sure you can get how I've done it. There's a little mistake with this div right here. I placed it at somewhere wrong. Sorry about that. Okay, so we can go ahead and save that, and then we have it this way. So this is the way I want it to look with each of the lines over here separating each of them. So I think that this is working well, and it's great. Okay, so that's that. We're having our data showing up in front over here in our front end. Now, final thing we want to do is not have this so many decimal points. We want to round it off a bit. So to do that, we can just do this right up here. And to do that, what we need is to use a certain if we call it a method over here. So right now, HTML, we're going to come to this place where it says expenses.total expenses. Then we are going to put after the dollar sign, we put at decimal dot round. Bring open a bracket. Then we'll put our actual value for our expenses here. We can close the brackets, but before the bracket is closed, we need to put the decimal point we want to round to, which is 2. So if we click save, realize that it now only shows it to 2 decimal points. Okay, we go down to where the amount is added here too, and we do the same thing. So after our dollar sign, we go at decimal dot round, then open our brackets, we can put comma, 2 decimal places, then we close the brackets and we save. And that also rounds all of those up to 0.00. So thank you so much for following this tutorial. I hope it was helpful, and this is what we have now, and in the next video we'll move on from here. Thank you so much for your time. Bye bye.